Welcome everybody to another Dark Nook video. I've got this key. I got it in a little box of trinkets and I really don't know what to do with it. So I was wondering, what could I sculpt that has a key? And I decided on Mono from Little Nightmares 2. He's got a key on his coat that looks almost exactly like this one. So in this video, I'm going to take you through the sculpting process. I'm going to start by making an armature, then building out the armature, sculpting the figure, and then painting it. And you can watch the entire process, or you can use the chapter markers to jump to whatever part of the video you'd like to see. Thanks for checking out my video. I hope you enjoy this sculpting tutorial. So I start off with a base and an armature. The problem I'm going to run into is this guy is so little and his legs are so spindly. If I use regular sized armature wire, there's not going to be any room for clay on his legs. So I have to use a smaller gauge armature wire. But with armature wire this thin, I'm going to need something to give the clay something to grab onto. So I'm going to wrap it with floral wire. It's called floral wire because florists use it to hold together flower arrangements. I'm going to wrap it all around the armature so that the polymer clay has something to grab onto. After it's all wrapped up, I add the aluminum foil to build out the bulk of the structure that I'm going to sculpt over. Once I have the aluminum foil on and bulked out to the basic shape, then I start adding super sculpting. This is just a rough first pass to get a basic body shape. At this stage, I just want to make sure that I have Sculpey covering all the foil and wire. Once that's attached and blended together, then I'll start working on the rough details. Wrinkles in the pants, the belt, delineations between the shirt, the belt, the collar. At this stage, they're very rough because I'll be blending them down as I go along. If I started with the subtle detail that I want to end up with, well, as I go through the process of sculpting, they'd be practically invisible. So you have to go a little over the top at the beginning so that by the time you get to the end, it balances out right where you want it. I'll add in details to show where the seams are in his clothes and then blend those into the rest of the sculpt. I use an embossing tool on a lot of the wrinkles. That's the tool with the little metal ball at the end. It's really good, particularly with Sculpey, for creating realistic fabric wrinkles and skin wrinkles, because you can really kind of push the clay around in the wrinkle. It creates that appearance of a wrinkle that's not just perfectly smooth, like there's some resistance like you get with fabric. It does that really well. I use a dental pick for details that have a harsher, straighter edge, like the belt line and the seams in the pants. Now at this stage I start to add more detail like wrinkles in the shirt, but I'm only going to put details in places where I know they're going to be seen. You got to remember later in this sculpt he's going to have a trench coat that's going to cover up a lot of this surface area. So there's no point in sculpting details in a place where I'm just going to put another layer of clay over the top of them and you're never going to see them anyway. Also, when I'm sculpting, I like to keep in mind how I plan to paint this figure. I know that all these little details, like the wrinkles and the buttons, those are going to pick up a dry brushing very well and it's going to make them pop and look really nice. So I'm not just sculpting them to make them look good or realistic, I'm also sculpting them to enhance the paint job. Now admittedly, it would have been faster and easier to make Mono's bag head separately and then just cut it to shape. However, I had a couple of considerations. First, I wanted it to be stable enough that I could turn the sculpture up on its head to work on some of the other parts, and I didn't want to worry about having just a little wooden dowel holding the head on that might break. Also, I didn't want the bag head to look perfectly square, like some block of cheese that had been cut with a knife. Once I had Mono's bag head basically where I wanted it, it was time to start on the coat. So I rolled out and cut a piece of Sculpey into a nice thin sheet. Not too thin, because there's not going to be anything supporting this piece of Sculpey. It's just going to be hanging there, so it's going to be pretty fragile. So I don't want to make the piece of Sculpey too thin. I want it to be thick enough that it has a little bit of strength. Otherwise, it could just break off after it's baked. So I basically cut out a rhombus shape and then cut out a U shape in the top part so that it would have little flaps that could fold up to where the collar goes. But it wasn't quite enough to reach the neck, so I had to supplement it with a couple of little pieces and then blend those in. And once those were blended in, I blended the edges on the back part so that it came together as one piece and looked like a trench coat. And I blended up the edges under the armpits and kind of converted those blends into wrinkles. Then I added the collar. And that's just a simple matter of taking a couple of triangle-shaped pieces, poking them up around the neck, and then flattening them out. And then repeat the process for the back of the collar, but instead of triangles, just make a strip, tuck it in around the neck and flatten it out. Then I make the cuffs for the sleeves of the coat by cutting a little rectangle shape and wrapping it around the wrist. And smooth it out a little bit with the ball stylus tool to create a little bit of wrinkling. And then just repeat that process for the other cuff on the other coat sleeve and for the cuffs on the legs of the pants. After that, it's time to add some detail to the coat. So I add the buttons and the little strap where the key is going to be attached. Now, because I'm going to attach a real metal key to this little strap, I embedded a tiny piece of floral wire inside and poked a hole through the coat. So there's actually a little wire hook for that key to hang from, not just a piece of Sculpey that could break. But I disguised the wire by wrapping it in Sculpey and then sculpting it to look like the little fabric loop hanging off the coat that the key will hang from. Now, the one part of this project I wasn't looking forward to was the hands. Mono's hands are so tiny and dainty that sculpting them was going to be a pain. But then I realized I've got this Dr. Evil action figure, and his hands are perfect. They're exactly the right size for this scale. They're tiny, they're dainty. I'm just going to rip the hands off of Dr. Evil.
How about new, you crazy Dutch bastard?
And check that out. They're perfect. So once this is baked, I'll just glue them on and kit bash the hands. But I'm still going to have to sculpt the feet the old-fashioned way. Luckily, Mono's feet, while small, are still kind of blocky and basic, so they're not that hard to sculpt. Now, the way I sculpt feet is to rough out the basic foot shape, then cut in the toes. After that, it's just a matter of trimming the clay from one area and smoothing it over to another area to get the forms and structures of the foot, like the ball of the foot or the arch. Once that basic form is done, I add in details like the toenails. Now I'll have to cut the foot in half in order to position it around the armature wire. Then once it's placed around the wire, I'll blend it in and build up the heel and the ankle. Then once it's all blended in, I just repeat the process for the other foot. When the feet are all done, the sculpt gets a final brush down with 99% isopropyl alcohol to remove any fingerprints and to smooth out the wrinkles just a little bit more. And now that all the sculpting is done, it's into the oven with you. Once it's out of the oven and all cooled down, then I glue those Dr. Evil hands on. And once that glue is dry, it's on to paint. The first thing I do is a watered down wash of dark gray, so that dark color will drip down into any of the bits that I can't reach with a paintbrush, between the body and the coat. Then I leave the sculpt sitting upside down, so the wash can run down into all those low spots and dry. And while I wait for it to dry, I paint the base. I wanted to make it look like an old moldy floorboard, so I painted some exaggerated wood grain, then painted it brown, and then went over that with some moldy green and a little bit of black, stippling. So, when the base was done, and the first wash on the Mono figure had dried, then I painted the same dark gray color on the inside of the coat, and on the underside of Mono's bag, but this time not watered down. Then I painted Mono's bag mask, but I painted it a little lighter because I planned to darken it up later with some washes, and I didn't want it to get too dark, so I have to start a little bit lighter than I want it to end up. After that, it's a series of thin layers of paint over the coat and clothes. That way, it lets some of the color from the previous paint layer show through. This helps create that sort of ratty, worn look. I paint a light, pale flesh tone over the hands and the feet so that they'll match up. So I start with the lighter tans and browns. Then I go darker. But because the darker coat is thin, it lets some of the light colors show through a little bit. Then I paint on the final colors and go over that with a dry brush. And after that's all dry, I do a final black wash. I put the black wash on the bag mask. Then I use a wet paper towel to remove most of it. This darkens the colors a bit and makes the bag look a little dirty. It also helps pop the details by darkening the seam lines. When the whole thing is dry, I grab my trusty pliers and attach the key. And now Mono is all done. I think it turned out looking pretty good. I hope you enjoyed this tutorial, and if you did, please hit that like button and leave a comment. And if you want to see more FX Maker content like sculpting, painting, mask making, then subscribe to my channel and hit that bell icon so you don't miss any new content. Thanks for checking out my video.